My fiance left me a protein shake with a cute note. When I mentioned splitting it with his son, he dropped his coffee cup and went completely white. My fiance left me a protein shake with a sweet note. I said I split it with his son after our workout. He went white. You gave half to Ethan. The kitchen counter was still cold under my palms when I told Adrian about sharing his thoughtful breakfast surprise. He'd been standing by the coffee maker, casual in his weekend clothes, asking about my morning run with his 12-year-old son. It was great, I said, still catching my breath from the 5-loop we'd finished 30 minutes earlier. And thank you so much for that protein shake you left me. That was really sweet. Ethan and I split it after our workout since we were both starving. The glass Adrian had been holding slipped from his fingers and shattered against the tile floor, but that wasn't what made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was his face draining of all color until he looked like he might vomit or pass out, or both. His lips moved without sound for 3 full seconds before he managed to choke out those 4 words that would destroy everything I thought I knew about the man I was supposed to marry in 6 weeks. You gave half to Ethan. I'd been living with Adrian Thornton and his son for 8 months when that Saturday morning blew my entire world apart like a grenade detonating in my chest. We'd met through a mutual friend at a charity fundraiser about a year and a half earlier, and the connection had been instant and intense in all the ways romantic comedies promise, but rarely deliver in real life. Adrian was a pharmaceutical sales representative with a corner office downtown, a beautiful colonial house in the suburbs, and a son he shared custody of with his ex-wife Melissa. He seemed perfect, honestly. Attentive without being clingy, successful without being arrogant, and incredibly patient with blending our lives together at a pace that felt natural rather than forced. His son Ethan was shy at first, but gradually warmed up to me, especially after I started joining their Saturday morning runs and teaching him how to make my grandmother's famous chocolate chip cookies every other weekend when he stayed with us. The protein shakes had started appearing about 2 months ago, always on Saturday mornings when Ethan was with his mother, and I'd sleep in late after working overtime during the week at my job as a hospital administrator. Adrian would leave them in the refrigerator with little notes written on sticky paper attached to the glass. Thought you might need this after I wore you out last night with a winky face. Breakfast for my beautiful bride-to-be. Drink up. You're going to need your energy for later. The notes were corny and sweet, the kind of small romantic gesture that made me feel cherished and loved in a relationship that seemed almost too good to be true after years of disappointing dates and relationships that fizzled out after a few months of mediocre compatibility. I'd never question the shakes because why would I? They tasted slightly bitter, but protein powder always tastes somewhat unpleasant regardless of the advertised flavors that promise chocolate or vanilla, but deliver something closer to chalky sadness. I drink them quickly, usually while getting ready for whatever Saturday activity we had planned, whether that was brunch with friends or antiquing in the historic district, or just lazy hours on the couch watching movies and planning our upcoming wedding. The shakes made me feel slightly nauseous sometimes, and I'd occasionally have to lie down for an hour or two with what I assumed was just my body adjusting to the protein supplement or maybe mild lactose intolerance acting up. Adrian would always seem concerned when I felt sick, bringing me water and crackers, suggesting I rest while he ran errands or worked on projects around the house. But this particular Saturday was different because Ethan had unexpectedly stayed over Friday night. Melissa had called around 8 p.m. saying she had a last-minute work emergency and asking if we could take Ethan a day early. Adrian had seemed slightly annoyed by the change in schedule, but agreed because he never wanted Ethan to feel unwanted or like an inconvenience to our household. So Ethan had slept in the guest room, and Saturday morning, I'd woken up early out of habit and suggested we go for a run together since Adrian mentioned he had early conference calls for work. The protein shake had been waiting in the refrigerator with a note that said, "Good morning, gorgeous. Thought you'd need this today," and I'd grabbed it without thinking. Assuming Adrian had prepared it before Ethan's unexpected arrival changed our weekend plans. Ethan and I had split the shake, each drinking about half from separate glasses I'd poured it into, and then headed out for our 5 mi route through the neighborhood trails. We talked about school and his upcoming science fair project and whether he wanted to learn how to bake bread next weekend. Normal, wonderful stepmother-stepson bonding that had made me feel like our blended family was actually working, and that marrying Adrian meant gaining not just a husband, but a son who was starting to trust and accept me as a permanent part of his life. We'd gotten back to the house sweaty and happy, and I'd been telling Adrian about how Ethan had beaten his personal best time when I'd mentioned splitting the protein shake. Now, Adrian was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something wild and terrified and desperate. "Where's Ethan now?" he demanded, his voice cracking on his son's name. "He's upstairs taking a shower," I answered slowly, confusion, and the first tendrils of real fear starting to wrap around my throat like cold fingers. "Adrian, what's wrong? What was in that shake?" He ignored my question and grabbed his phone from the counter, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it twice while trying to unlock the screen. He dialed a number and pressed the phone to his ear, pacing in tight circles on the kitchen floor while glass from the broken coffee mug crunched under his shoes. "I need you to come to the house immediately," he said into the phone, his voice low and urgent. "There's been a situation with the project we discussed." "Yes, right now. I don't care what you're doing. Get here in the next 20 minutes or everything is ruined." He ended the call and looked at me with eyes that seemed almost calculating now that the initial shock had faded slightly. "Meredith, I need you to do exactly what I say. Don't ask questions, just listen. We need to get Ethan to throw up everything he drank this morning. Make him vomit right now before his body absorbs any more of the shake. The clinical detachment in his voice made something in my chest feel like it was cracking apart. This wasn't concern or worry. This was cold calculation. The tone of someone solving a problem rather than protecting his child. I took a step backward, my sneakers squeaking against the tile, and pulled my own phone from the pocket of my running shorts. "What was in the shake, Adrian?" I repeated. And this time, my voice came out harder and clearer than I'd expected, given that my entire body was starting to tremble with adrenaline. "Tell me right now, or I'm calling 911. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: anger, fear, resignation, and finally a kind of desperate pleading that looked wrong on his features. "It's not what you think," he started. But I was already dialing emergency services because whatever explanation he was about to offer, it wasn't going to justify the way he'd reacted to learning his son had consumed half of something intended for me. The 911 operator answered on the second ring, and I forced myself to speak calmly and clearly, even though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. "I need an ambulance and police at 2847 Oakmont Drive. My stepson and I consumed something that may have been poisoned or contaminated, and his father is acting strangely and refusing to tell me what was in it." Adrian lunged toward me, trying to grab the phone, but I'd already moved toward the hallway and was running up the stairs toward Ethan's bathroom while the operator asked me to stay on the line and describe any symptoms we were experiencing. "No symptoms yet?" I gasped, taking the stairs two at a time. "But the boy's father specifically told me to make him vomit before his body absorbs whatever was in the drink we shared." I pounded on the bathroom door. "Ethan, honey, I need you to open up right now. It's important." The water shut off, and Ethan appeared a moment later wrapped in a towel, his hair dripping and his face confused. "What's wrong?" he asked, and I tried to smile reassuringly, even though I was pretty sure my expression looked more like a grimace of panic. "We need to go to the hospital, sweetheart. Both of us, just as a precaution, because I think the protein shake we drank might have had something bad in it. Your dad is really worried about you." Ethan's eyes widened, and he asked the question I'd been desperately trying not to think about. "Did Dad try to poison you?" The words hung in the air between us like smoke, impossible to unsee or unhear once they'd been spoken aloud by this perceptive 12-year-old who'd apparently noticed more about his father's behavior than I'd given him credit for. Before I could formulate any kind of response that wouldn't terrify him further, we heard sirens approaching the house. The 911 operator was still on the line, and I told her the emergency vehicles were arriving and asked if we should try to induce vomiting before medical help arrived. She instructed me to wait for the paramedics unless we were experiencing severe symptoms like difficulty breathing or loss of consciousness, and to keep any containers or evidence of what we'd consumed. The next 2 hours were a chaotic blur of paramedics, police officers, and urgent transport to the emergency room, where Ethan and I were both given activated charcoal to drink and had blood samples drawn for toxicology screening. The ER doctor, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Arifai, Patricia Blackwood with kind eyes and a non-nonsense demeanor, explained that they were treating us for potential poisoning, but wouldn't know exactly what substance we'd been exposed to until the lab results came back in several hours. She asked detailed questions about the protein shake, what it tasted like, how much each of us had consumed, what time we drunk it, and whether we'd experienced any symptoms like nausea, dizziness, blurred vision, or difficulty breathing. I told her everything while holding Ethan's hand in the hospital bed next to mine, including Adrian's terrified reaction when I'd mentioned sharing the shake and his insistence that we needed to make Ethan vomit immediately. Dr. Blackwood's expression grew increasingly serious as I talked, and she excused herself to make a phone call to someone she referred to as our toxicology specialist. 20 minutes later, a younger doctor appeared, introducing himself as Dr. Raymond Cole from the hospital's Poison Control Center with a specialization in pharmaceutical toxicology. He asked me to describe the taste of the shake again, the color, the consistency, and any unusual characteristics I'd noticed. "Bitter," I said, trying to remember details that had seemed completely unimportant at the time. "More bitter than usual, actually. And it had this slightly metallic aftertaste that I remember thinking was weird, but I just figured Adrian had used a different brand of protein powder or something." Dr. Cole exchanged a meaningful glance with Dr. Blackwood, and something in that silent communication made my stomach drop, even though the activated charcoal I'd been forced to drink. "We're going to run a comprehensive toxicology panel," he said carefully, "but based on your description and your fiance's reaction when he learned you'd shared the shake, I have some preliminary suspicions about what we might be dealing with." Meanwhile, back at the house, police were apparently having a very interesting conversation with Adrian. I learned this later from Detective James Whitmore, a veteran investigator with the county police department, who had 26 years of experience and a face that looked like it had seen every terrible thing humans could do to each other. He showed up at the hospital around 1 p.m., about 3 hours after the ambulance had brought Ethan and me to the ER, and asked if I felt well enough to answer some questions about my relationship with Adrian and the events leading up to that morning's incident. Ethan had been moved to a private room for observation, and his mother, Melissa, had arrived about an hour earlier, furious and terrified in equal measure, demanding to know what kind of house I'd been letting her son stay in, and threatening legal action against everyone within shouting distance. Detective Whitmore sat down in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside my hospital bed and pulled out a small notebook and pen, the old-fashioned kind that made him seem like a character from a crime novel rather than a real police officer investigating what might be an attempted attempted murder. Miss Chen, he began, and I immediately interrupted to say my name was Meredith Kensington, not Chen, and I had no idea where he'd gotten that information. He apologized and corrected his notes, then started over. Miss Kensington, I need to ask you some questions about your fiancé, Adrian Thornton, and your relationship with him. Has he ever been violent toward you? Has he ever threatened you or made you feel unsafe in any way? I shook my head automatically, then stopped and really thought about the question, because if someone had asked me that same thing 12 hours earlier, I would have laughed at the absurdity of it. Adrian had been perfect, attentive, romantic, supportive of my career, patient with blending our families. But now, with the memory of his face draining white and that desperate panic in his eyes when he'd learned Ethan had drunk half of the shake intended for me, I found myself reconsidering every moment of our relationship through a new and terrifying lens. No, I finally answered. He's never been violent, but there were things that seemed weird in retrospect now that I'm thinking about it with fresh eyes. Detective Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his pen poised over the notebook. What kind of things? I told him about the protein shakes that had started appearing 2 months ago, always on Saturday mornings when Ethan was with his ex-wife and I'd be alone in the house with Adrian. I told him about feeling sick after drinking them sometimes, needing to lie down with nausea that I'd attributed to lactose intolerance or just not being used to protein supplements. I told him about Adrian's concern during those episodes, how he'd bring me water and crackers and suggest I rest while he went out to run errands for hours at a time. Did you ever go to a doctor about these symptoms? The detective asked, and I admitted I hadn't because they'd never seemed severe enough to warrant medical attention, just mild nausea and fatigue that would pass after a few hours of sleep. Detective Whitmore wrote extensively in his notebook and then asked a question that made my blood run cold despite the warm hospital air. Miss Kensington, are you aware that you're named as the primary beneficiary on a life insurance policy worth $850,000 that Adrian purchased 6 months ago? I stared at him, my mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. I have no idea what you're talking about, I managed to say. We have life insurance through our jobs, but I don't know anything about an additional policy. The detective showed me a photocopy of an insurance application with my forged signature at the bottom, listing Adrian as the policy owner and beneficiary in the event of my death. We found this in his home office during our search of the property, along with several other documents that paint a concerning picture of your fiancé's financial situation. It turned out that Adrian Thornton, successful pharmaceutical sales representative with the corner office and the beautiful colonial house, was drowning in debt to the tune of $340,000, gambling debts mostly, according to bank records and credit card statements the police had seized from his home office. He'd been losing money consistently for at least 2 years at various casinos and online gambling sites, and had recently taken out a second mortgage on the house that was already underwater due to the collapse in property values in our area. His salary was good, but not good enough to cover his losses and maintain the lifestyle he'd been presenting to me and everyone else in his social circle. The life insurance policy on me was his solution to his financial crisis, and the protein shakes were apparently his method of slowly poisoning me in a way that might look like natural causes, or perhaps a tragic health crisis in a young woman with no prior medical issues. Dr. Cole came back around 4 p.m. with preliminary toxicology results that confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. The protein shake had contained a significant dose of dioxin, a cardiac medication that Adrian had easy access to through his pharmaceutical sales connections. Dioxin is particularly dangerous because it's difficult to detect in standard drug screenings unless you're specifically looking for it. Dr. Cole explained, his face grave. In small, repeated doses, it can cause symptoms that mimic various other conditions: nausea, fatigue, confusion, irregular heartbeat. Eventually, with enough exposure over time, it can cause cardiac arrest that might be attributed to an undiagnosed heart condition, especially in someone young and otherwise healthy who wouldn't typically undergo extensive cardiac testing. The doctor went on to explain that Ethan and I had consumed enough dioxin in that single shake to cause serious harm if it hadn't been split between us and if we hadn't received medical intervention so quickly. As it was, we'd both likely need cardiac monitoring for the next 24 to 48 hours to ensure the medication didn't cause any dangerous arrhythmias or other complications. You're both very lucky, Dr. Cole said quietly. If you'd consumed the full shake alone as your fiancé intended, and if you'd dismissed the symptoms as food poisoning or stomach flu like you'd been doing with the previous doses, you might not have survived the weekend. The amount of dioxin in that shake was enough to kill you within hours. I asked the question I'd been dreading since Detective Whitmore had showed me the forged insurance documents. How long has he been poisoning me? Dr. Cole and Detective Whitmore exchanged glances, and the detective answered, based on the pattern of Saturday morning shakes starting about 2 months ago, and your reported symptoms of nausea and fatigue following consumption, we believe he's been administering sublethal doses for approximately 8 weeks, building up the amount gradually to avoid sudden severe symptoms that might prompt immediate medical attention. This weekend's dose was significantly higher than the previous ones, probably because he was getting impatient, or because he needed the insurance payout sooner rather than later to cover debts that were becoming critical. The methodical calculation of it made me feel sick in a way that had nothing to do with digoxin poisoning. Adrian had been slowly killing me for 2 months, watching me feel nauseated and tired, bringing me water and crackers like a caring fiance while he waited for the poison to accumulate in my system to lethal levels. He'd been planning my funeral while planning our wedding. He'd been kissing me goodnight and imagining my life insurance payout. The man I'd fallen in love with, the man I'd been building a future with, the man I'd been helping raise his son, had been systematically murdering me in the most cowardly, calculated way imaginable. Detective Whitmore asked if I'd be willing to provide a formal statement and testify against Adrian when the case went to trial. I said yes without hesitation, and spent the next several hours going through every detail of our relationship with the detective and a prosecutor from the district attorney's office named Rebecca Steinberg, who specialized in attempted murder cases. We talked about the protein shakes, the life insurance policy I'd never known about, the times I'd felt sick, and Adrian's response, his financial situation that I'd been completely unaware of, and the Saturday morning routine that had been designed around ensuring I'd be alone and vulnerable when I consumed the poison drinks. The prosecutor explained that Adrian had already been arrested and charged with 2 counts of attempted murder, one for me and one for Ethan, since he'd knowingly allowed his son to be in the house when a poisoned drink was in the refrigerator, creating a foreseeable risk to the child. His lawyer is already floating a defense that the shake was intended for consumption by you only, and that he had no reason to believe Ethan would drink any of it, but that's not going to hold up given the circumstances, Rebecca Steinberg said with the confidence of someone who'd prosecuted dozens of similar cases. The fact that he kept deoxin in the house with access to his minor child, the fact that he prepared a poisoned drink and left it in a common area accessible to anyone, and the fact that his reaction to learning Ethan had consumed some of it was panic rather than immediately calling for medical help demonstrates a depraved indifference to human life that supports the attempted murder charge. Over the next several days, more evidence emerged that painted an even darker picture of Adrian's plan and his desperation. Police found a burner phone in his car with text messages to the person he'd called that Saturday morning when he'd panicked about Ethan drinking the shake. That person turned out to be his former college roommate, a disgraced doctor named Thomas Price, who'd lost his medical license 3 years earlier for prescription fraud and had apparently been helping Adrian acquire and prepare the digoxin doses. The text messages documented their entire conspiracy, including discussions about the optimal dosing schedule to avoid detection, the best way to forge my signature on the insurance documents, and a backup plan involving making my death look like a suicide if the cardiac arrest method didn't work quickly enough. Thomas Price was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and illegal distribution of controlled substances. His text messages provided prosecutors with evidence that Adrian had been planning this for at least 6 months, starting shortly after he'd discovered the full extent of his gambling debts and realized he had no legitimate way to pay them off before his creditors took legal action or worse. The messages also revealed that Adrian had researched my family medical history, looking for any conditions that might make a cardiac death seem plausible, and had been disappointed to discover I came from a family of people who lived into their 90s with no history of heart disease. That's why he'd needed the digoxin doses to be high enough to ensure death, but spread out enough to potentially build a case for undiagnosed heart problems if there was an autopsy. Melissa, Ethan's mother, filed for emergency full custody and succeeded in having Adrian's parental rights suspended, pending the outcome of the criminal trial. Ethan spent 2 days in the hospital under cardiac observation, and then went home with his mother to process the trauma of learning his father had tried to murder his future stepmother and had accidentally endangered his own son in the process. Melissa brought him to visit me once before I was discharged, and Ethan hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'm sorry," over and over like any of this was somehow his fault instead of his father's calculated evil. I told him he had nothing to apologize for and that he'd probably saved my life by unexpectedly staying over that Friday night because his presence in the house had changed the routine and led to us splitting the shake instead of me drinking it alone and likely dying before anyone realized something was wrong. I stayed in the hospital for 4 days total while doctors monitored my cardiac function and continued to treat me for the accumulated deoxin in my system from the previous weeks of poisoning. My parents flew in from Oregon when they heard what had happened, and my mother alternated between crying at my bedside and expressing her desire to personally strangle Adrian for what he'd done to her daughter. My father was quieter, but equally furious, and he spent hours on the phone with lawyers and police officers and insurance investigators, making sure that Adrian couldn't access any of our shared assets or attempt to claim any rights to property or finances that were in my name. The wedding obviously was canceled. That task fell to my best friend, Sophia Chen, who handled the notifications to vendors and guests with the same efficiency she brought to her job as an event coordinator. Most people were understanding and horrified when they learned the reason for the cancellation, though a few seemed more interested in the scandalous details than in my well-being. Sophia fielded those inquiries with a polite firmness that made me grateful to have her running interference while I recovered, and tried to process the fact that the man I'd been planning to marry had been planning my murder instead. The engagement ring came off my finger in the hospital, and I gave it to Detective Whitmore as evidence since it turned out Adrian had purchased it with a credit card that was maxed out and already in collections. Everything about our relationship had been built on lies and desperation and calculation. The romantic gestures, the sweet notes, the patient blending of our families, all of it had been theater designed to get me to trust him enough to marry him and make his financial problems disappear with my life insurance payout. I'd been so eager to believe in the fairy tale tale of finding love after years of disappointing relationships, that I'd missed every red flag and ignored every instinct that tried to warn me something wasn't quite right. Adrian's preliminary hearing was held 3 weeks after his arrest, and I attended with a prosecutor's victim advocate sitting beside me in the courtroom gallery. Adrian looked smaller somehow, diminished without the confident charm he'd always projected. His lawyer tried to argue for reduced bail, claiming Adrian was a respected businessman with strong ties to the community and no flight risk. The prosecutor presented the evidence of attempted murder, the forged insurance documents, the text messages with Thomas Price, and the ongoing financial investigation that had uncovered even more debt than initially discovered. The judge denied bail, citing the severity of the charges and the documented evidence of planning and premeditation that suggested Adrian was a danger to both me and potentially others who stood between him and financial solvency. I didn't feel triumphant watching Adrian be led out of the courtroom in handcuffs and an orange jail jumpsuit. I felt hollow and betrayed and stupid for ever believing that someone like him could actually love someone like me. The prosecutor, Rebecca Steinberg, put her hand on my shoulder as we left the courthouse and told me something I needed to hear. None of this was your fault. Predators like Adrian Thornton are experts at manipulation and deception. He chose his targets carefully and built an elaborate false persona designed specifically to gain your trust and access to your life. You're not stupid for believing him. You're human and you're alive because you trusted your instincts when something felt wrong instead of rationalizing away his panic when he learned Ethan had drunk that shake. The trial took 8 months to finally reach court, and during that time, I had to rebuild my entire life from the foundation up. I moved out of Adrian's house within a week of leaving the hospital, taking only my personal belongings and leaving behind all the shared items and memories of a relationship that had never been real. I found a small apartment across town and started therapy with Dr. Valerie Kirkland, a psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery and betrayal. The therapy sessions were brutal and necessary, forcing me to examine not just what Adrian had done to me, but why I'd been so eager to ignore the warning signs that something was wrong with our relationship and his behavior. Work was both a refuge and a reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. My colleagues at the hospital were supportive and horrified, and my boss gave me flexible scheduling to attend court dates and therapy appointments. I threw myself into my job as hospital administrator with renewed focus, finding purpose in the daily challenges of healthcare management and taking satisfaction in solving problems that actually had solutions instead of trying to fix a relationship with a man who'd been planning my death. Some nights I'd lie awake remembering the taste of those bitter protein shakes and wondering if I'd felt my heart starting to fail during those Saturday afternoons when I'd been so tired and nauseous. Dr. Cole had assured me I'd make a full recovery with no lasting cardiac damage since the intervention had been so quick, but the psychological scars were deeper and would take longer to heal. Ethan stayed in contact through his mother, sending me cards and drawings and eventually asking if he could visit once his therapist said he was ready. Melissa supervised the visits at first, clearly uncertain about allowing her son to maintain any connection to the situation that had almost gotten him killed, but she gradually warmed to the idea when she saw how much our relationship meant to Ethan, and how carefully I made sure he understood that none of what happened was his fault. He'd lost his father to prison and gained a traumatic understanding of human evil that no 12-year-old should have to process. But he was resilient and brave in ways that broke my heart and gave me hope simultaneously. The trial itself was a media circus that I tried to avoid as much as possible, though my testimony was obviously required and ended up being featured in every local news broadcast and newspaper. I sat in the witness box for 3 hours and walked through every detail of my relationship with Adrian. The protein shakes, my symptoms, the Saturday morning when everything fell apart, and the discovery of his gambling debts and life insurance fraud. Adrian's lawyer tried to suggest I'd known about the dioxin and had consumed it voluntarily as some kind of elaborate frame job, but that defense strategy fell apart under the weight of evidence, including the forged insurance documents, the text messages with Thomas Price, and the testimony from Dr. Cole and Dr. Blackwood about the medical treatment Ethan and I had required. The prosecution presented a devastating case that included not just the attempted murder charges, but also insurance fraud, forgery, reckless endangerment of a child, and conspiracy charges related to Thomas Price's involvement. Expert witnesses explained how digoxin poisoning worked, how it could be disguised as natural causes, and how the dosing schedule documented in Adrian's text messages demonstrated clear premeditation and planning. Financial experts detailed his gambling debts and the timeline of his financial collapse that coincided with when he'd started researching life insurance policies and cardiac medications. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. At sentencing 2 months later, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement. I'd written and rewritten it dozens of times, trying to find words adequate to describe what Adrian had stolen from me beyond just my health and safety. He'd stolen my ability to trust romantic partners, my faith that good relationships existed, my confidence in my own judgment about people's character. He'd stolen months of my life spent planning a wedding that was actually a funeral. He'd stolen my sense of safety in my own home, my peace of mind, my assumption that people who said they loved you actually meant it instead of seeing you as a financial asset to be liquidated through murder. The judge sentenced Adrian to 42 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Thomas Price received 15 years for for his role in the conspiracy. The life insurance company canceled the fraudulent policy and flagged Adrienne's name in industry databases to prevent any similar schemes in the future. Melissa filed a civil lawsuit on Ethan's behalf for the trauma and endangerment and won a judgment that would provide for his therapy and education from Adrienne's remaining assets after the criminal restitution. Adrienne's house was sold to pay his debts and legal fees, and the proceeds were split among his creditors with nothing left over for him or his family. I thought I'd feel satisfied or vindicated or triumphant when the sentence was handed down, but mostly I just felt tired and sad about all the time I'd wasted on a man who'd never existed outside the performance he'd crafted to gain my trust. The real Adrienne Thornton was a desperate gambler and coward who'd chosen murder over honest work or bankruptcy or asking for help. The Adrienne I'd thought I loved had been a fiction designed to exploit my desire for partnership and family and romance. Grieving for that fictional person while simultaneously being grateful the real person was in prison created a complicated emotional landscape that therapy was slowly helping me navigate. A year after the trial ended, I was doing better. Not perfect, not completely healed, but better. I'd started dating again cautiously with much stronger boundaries and a new ability to trust my instincts when something felt wrong instead of rationalizing away concerns. Ethan was thriving in school and therapy and still visited me once a month for our traditional chocolate chip cookie baking sessions. My apartment had become a home instead of just a place to hide from memories. Work continued to provide structure and purpose, and I'd even gotten a promotion to senior administrator that came with increased responsibilities and salary. Sophia Chen organized a small gathering on the 1-year anniversary of that terrible Saturday morning, inviting just my closest friends and family to celebrate survival and recovery. We didn't talk about Adrienne or the trial or the poisoning. We just ate good food and told funny stories and reminded each other that life continued beyond trauma and betrayal. My mother made a toast to resilience and second chances and daughters who were strong enough to rebuild their lives from rubble. I cried, but they were good tears for once. Grateful tears instead of the bitter ones I'd shed so many times over the past year. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, remembering the metallic taste of those protein shakes, or the look on Adrienne's face when he'd realized his son had consumed half of the poison intended for me. Sometimes I check the locks on my doors 3 times before bed and leave lights on in every room because darkness feels too vulnerable. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Melissa hadn't called that Friday night asking us to take Ethan early. If I drunk that full shake alone on Saturday morning as Adrienne had planned. If I died thinking the man I loved was grieving instead of collecting insurance money to pay his gambling debts. Those thoughts are poison of a different kind, and I try not to let them take root in my mind where they'd grow into paranoia and isolation. But I'm here. I'm alive. Ethan is safe. Adrienne is in prison where he belongs. Those are the facts that matter more than the nightmares or the trust issues or the complicated grief for a relationship that never existed outside my hopeful imagination. I survived something that should have killed me, not through any particular strength or wisdom on my part, but through luck and timing and a 12-year-old boy's unexpected sleepover. I'll take survival however it comes, even if the victory feels hollow sometimes. Dr. Kirkland says healing isn't linear, and that I shouldn't expect to wake up one day magically free from the trauma Adrienne inflicted. She says, recovery is more like climbing a mountain where some days you make progress and other days you slide backward, but the overall trajectory is still upward. As long as you keep trying, I'm trying. Some days that's all I can manage, but it's enough. It has to be enough because the alternative is letting Adrienne win even from his prison cell by stealing not just the years he'd planned to take through murder, but all the years that came after through fear and bitterness. I don't know if I'll ever marry or if I'll ever trust someone enough to blend my life with theirs as completely as I'd planned to blend mine with Adrienne's. Maybe that's okay. Maybe happiness doesn't require a partner or a wedding or the fairy tale ending I'd been chasing when I'd met him at that charity fundraiser. Maybe happiness looks like Sunday morning pancakes with Ethan, or succeeding at my job, or laughing with Sophia over wine on Friday nights, or simply waking up and knowing I'm safe and the day is mine to do with as I choose. Maybe that's enough. The protein shake with the sweet note almost killed me, but the split-second decision to share it with Ethan saved both our lives and exposed a monster hiding behind a charming smile and romantic gestures. Adrienne thought he was so clever, so calculating, so certain his plan would work, and he'd get away with murder disguised as natural causes. But he didn't account for variables like schedule changes or generous impulses, or a stepmother who'd share her breakfast with her future stepson without a second thought. He didn't account for getting caught, getting exposed, getting exactly what he deserved. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.